The American Revolution was a removal of government in the 13 colonies, which was controlled by the British. Revolution is an overthrow of government of man. The American Revolution began with the Navigation Acts, which created the first phases of tension between the colonists and Great Britain. The Navigation Acts were invoked in 1650, shortly after Great Britain had realized that they were getting very little income from the colonies. One of the colonies' main purpose was to make money for Great Britain through cash crops. The reason Great Britain wasn't receiving the expected profit was because the colonists were trading with the Dutch. For these reasons, the Navigation Acts were created. The Navigation Acts demanded that all exports from the colonies be transported via English ships, for all trade to go through England, for all products produced in the colonies to be exported to England. The colonists saw these policies as tyrannical injustice, so the colonists disobeyed the Navigation Acts and began to smuggle with the Dutch. When King James II of England realized that the colonists were ignoring the Navigation Acts, he created the Dominion of New England in 1686. The Dominion of New England was the merging of New Jersey, New York, and New England into one large colony. The colonists residing in these areas lost the rights to self-government and the rights of assembly. Edmund Andros, a good friend of the king, was appointed to govern the Dominion of New England. Fortunately for the colonists, in 1688 the Glorious Revolution took place in Great Britain. King James II was removed from power, and William and Mary took the throne. Afterwards, William and Mary invoked the English Bill of Rights and restored representative government in England. This caused the Boston Revolt in the colonies, which removed Andros from power. After these events had happened, colonists became less dependent on Great Britain. Another major factor of the American Revolution was the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was fought over American territory, as well as the fur trade, which France was currently controlling. Although this war took place in North America, the colonists did not fight in it. The war began in 1754, and British troops were stationed all over the colonies. This caused the Albany Conference to be held in 1754. At this conference, Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan, which states that the colonies should unify in order to make one federal government, to unify for common defense, and to create a militia. The colonists rejected this plan from fear of upsetting the king, but it was the first major movement towards self-government. A few years later, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the French and Indian War in favor of the British. The Treaty of Paris gave England much of North America, such as the Ohio River Valley region and parts of Canada. Soon after, England invoked the Proclamation Act, which prohibited the colonists from expanding westward past the Appalachian Mountains into England's newly acquired land. However, even though England had just received new land from the Treaty of Paris, they were at a loss financially because of the war efforts. The person appointed responsible for obtaining Britain's wealth back was George Grenville, Prime Minister of England at the time. He then persuaded Parliament to pass the Sugar Act in 1764. The Sugar Act was a tax on raw sugar and molasses, but also a tax on all imports. It was a policy aimed directly at colonial merchants, but also indirectly affected the colonists, who ignored the Sugar Act by continuing to smuggle. But the consequences for ignoring the Sugar Act were severe, and violated the due process of law. Cargo on ships could be seized at all times without a warrant, and the trial would take place in a Vice Admiralty Court. The judges in a Vice Admiralty Court would give 5% of the seized cargo, which was essentially a bribe from Britain to assume that all people being tried were guilty. Colonists, such as James Otis, were outraged by the Sugar Act. Otis protested against it, saying that without representation from the colonies in Parliament, Britain had no rights to invoke policies against the colonies. Soon after the Sugar Act came into play, the Stamp Act was invoked. The Stamp Act of 1765 required a tax stamp on all printed materials and required a tax on all imports and exports. It was the first direct tax on the colonists. Rebel groups such as the Sons of Liberty began vandalizing symbols of British authority after the Stamp Act became a policy. They were politically motivated against loyalists or anyone still loyal to the king. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act were both repealed in 1766. But soon after they were repealed, Britain invoked the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act simply stated that the British Parliament had as much power in the colonies as it did in England. In 1767, a new set of laws were invoked, called the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts placed taxes on popular items such as lead, glass, paper, and paint. Colonists retaliated with a non-importation agreement, which was a refusal to buy British goods. This caused a serious economic problem in Britain. The British East India Trading Company went on the verge of bankruptcy, and the sales in the colonies went down by 40%. This led to outbreaks of violence in the colonies. One of these outbreaks of violence was the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was one of the most major causes for the Revolution. In 1770, British troops shot and killed 5 civilians. John Adams was the troops' defense lawyer, and most of the soldiers were acquitted. But the tension between the colonists rose, and more violence would soon follow. The Tea Act was a policy invoked by Britain in order to help the British East India Trading Company escape bankruptcy. It caused a monopoly on tea. The only available distributor of tea was the British East India Trading Company. The company tried to sell tea to colonists at a much cheaper price. However, Sim Adams organized what is known as the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party took place in 1776. Sim Adams and other colonists dumped all the tea carried on 3 English ships into the water. As punishment for the Boston Tea Party, Britain invoked the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts was a collection of 5 different acts. Each act was an infringement on the colonists' rights. This further caused the colonists to rebel. Committees of correspondence were soon formed. These committees led to the start of the First Continental Congress, and were similar to underground governments. The First Continental Congress was a convention where 12 states showed up in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. It was a response to the Intolerable Acts. Here they planned to protest British policies and urged individual colonies to set up militias, which they soon did. Great Britain found out about the militia soon afterwards, and in 1775 they sent out 1,000 troops to confiscate firearms and arrest rebels in Lexington, Mass. The colonists fought back, and this was known as the Battle of Lexington, the first battle of the American Revolution. Common Sense, a pamphlet by Thomas Paine, began to circulate around the colonies. It stated that colonists no longer needed to live under the King's rule, as it was no longer a benefit for them to remain colonies, and that they were strong enough to become their own country. The Declaration of Independence was created by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, 6 months after Common Sense became popular. The United States was formed. The goals of the Revolution were self-government and development. These goals were successfully met because the United States was able to create its own government. It was also able to develop into a much larger country and become the premier empire in modern times. The United States uses its military and financial assistance as strategic influence towards other countries. And those are 2 factors of imperialism.